tonight's stories all come from one small village and one old year, because Vertoon kept its strange accounts together in the memory of the parish. The village stood in Worcestershire, in the west of England, with St. Mildred's Church, a mill on the Wen Brook, and 3 great fields divided into long strips around its 40 households. We will follow its year from Plough Monday in 1348 through seed time, Roge Shun, harvest, and the deep winter, until the ploughs return to Church Field 1 year later. The rain is resting on the thatch, and the fire has been drawn low, so we begin in the cold first light with Walter at a Hale, his ox team, and the dark ground called the Blacklands, where every furrow in Calvertoon makes an old and careful bend. The court rolls of Calvertoon Manor run, with a few gaps where the damp got in, from the reign of the first King Edward down to the year I want to tell you about. And they are dull reading, which is their whole virtue, because a court roll only sets down what a village agreed had happened. Calvertoon was a small manor in Worcestershire. Some 40 households held of the Benedictine Abbey a poor shore, with a church called St. Mildred's, a mill on the Wen Brook, and 3 great open fields lying around it. Church Field, Mill Field, and Wood Field, each cut into long strips so that every family's land lay scattered in among everyone else's. What I am going to tell you comes partly out of those rolls, and partly out of what the ploughmen of the parish handed down, and the 2 accounts agree, which is the part worth sitting with. The year began, for working purposes, on Plough Monday, which was the first Monday after Twelfth Night, when the Christmas rest ended and the ploughs went back to the ground. On that morning in January of 1348, the men of Calvertoon carried the parish plough up to St. Mildred's to be blessed, because a plough was the most serious tool a village owned, and it did not go into the earth without a word said over it. And Sir John the parson said the word, and the boys dragged the plough once around the churchyard with ribbons on the beam, and after that the holiday was over and the real teams went out into the frost. The best ploughman in Calvertoon that year was a man named Walter at a Hale, which meant Walter who lived down at the nook of land by the brook, because in those days a man's second name told you where to find him. Walter held a yard land, about 30 acres, scattered in strips across the 3 fields, and in return he owed the Lord week work, so many days of each week given to the Demayan, which was the portion of the manor the abbey kept in its own hand. He plowed behind a team of 8 oxen made up from 3 households, his own beasts yoked in with his neighbors, because no single family kept 8 oxen, and the plowing was a thing the village could only do together. He had walked behind a team since he was a boy with the goad, and his father before him, and his father before that, on the same strips, in the same order, in the same weeks of the year. Now in Church Field, which was the field under plough that season, there lay a piece of ground called the Blacklands. It was a long strip, about a furlong from end to end, and it ran darker than the ground on either side of it, a deep, peaty color that held even in a dry summer, while the strips of ploughland bent around it instead of running through. From the church tower, the long lines of ridge and furrow could be seen going up the slope in good order, until every line bowed outward along one stretch, enclosed the dark ground within the field pattern, and came back true on the far side. No surveyor or reeve remembered in Calvertoon had laid that bend out, and that is the first thing to understand. A boy learning the plough was taught the turn along with everything else, where to ease the team and where to lean on the handles, and the turn at the Blacklands was simply part of the work, taught without explanation, because nobody had one. The furrow bowed there because it had always bowed there, and a plowman who kept his line true everywhere else in the parish made that one curve by settled habit, with no pause in his work. The manor court kept its own version of the custom among the bylaws read out at the great court after Michaelmas, the feast at the end of September when the harvest was done and the accounts were made up. There stood an entry fining any man 6 pence who should break ground upon the Blacklands, and 6 pence was real money, most of a week's wage. The entry was old when the oldest surviving roll was young, and here is the detail I would ask you to keep, because the whole story lives inside it. In all the years the rolls run, through every reeve who ever presided and every jury ever sworn, that fine was never once collected. A man did set a plow there once, but what the court found afterward left no broken ground on which the fine could be taken. The ground itself gave nobody any cause for stories, and I want to be fair to it, because winter frost and snow covered it with the rest of Churchfield, summer wind crossed it, and coarse dark grass grew there without ever being cut for hay. The beasts of the village did not graze it, and Roger the Hayward, the officer whose work it was to mind the hedges and take up stray animals into the pinfold. The little pound by the green would tell you that in 40 years of stray oxen and wandering pigs, he had never once had to fetch a beast off the Blacklands. They grazed the headlands right up to its edge, continued along that edge, and turned away without urging. It was only ground, but everything in the parish quietly went around it. The old men said the bend was older than the fields. That sounds impossible until you look at how such fields were made, because the strips of church field had been laid out lifetimes before any parchment. Each family's lands measured and scattered by an arrangement nobody recorded, and when they were laid out already turning. There was no scar of an older, straighter furrow underneath, no headland running through where a plow line used to go. The hollow lane, the sunken back way toward Pershore, was older than the manor, worn down between its banks by feet nobody could name, and the men of Culvertoon would tell you, without any particular weight on it, that the bend was older than the lane. The village had been fitted around the Blacklands from the start, and no one alive, and no one remembered by anyone alive, had ever been asked to agree to that. The one time the terms were tested, Walter had from his father, who stood in Churchfield the morning after and saw what there was to see. It happened in the hungry years, which is what the parish called the famine, that came when Walter's father was a young man. When it rained through 2 summers together, and the corn rotted in the ear and the seed corn was eaten, and there was real want in Culvertoon, the kind that empties a byre and silences a house. In the second of those years, a man named Allard, who had come into the village by marriage, he had paid his merché. The fine, a tenant paid the lord for leave to marry, and taken on his wife's family strips, found himself with 2 strips, too few to feed what his hearth had to feed. Allard was not a rash man, and afterward nobody spoke of him with any blame, because every man on that jury had hungry children of his own that year. He looked at the Blacklands lying dark and unworked in the middle of a starving parish, and he made up his mind the ground was ground. He went out to it on a morning in Lent with a borrowed team, when the field was empty because it was a fast day and most men were at their devotions, and he set his plow at the near end of the dark ground. The coulter, the iron knife that rides ahead of the share and cuts the sod for it, went in easily, his own word for it, easier than anywhere in the parish. The oxen went forward unwilling, leaning off the line, but they went, because oxen are obedient before they are anything else, and Allard cut half a furrow's length into the Blacklands before the team stopped. They did not bolt, and they did not bellow. They stopped altogether, and the led ox knelt down in the yoke and would not rise, and the others stood with their heads low and their breath steaming, and no goad and no word would move them one step more. And Allard stood a while in the quiet, his own account given freely for the rest of his life to anyone who asked. And he looked at the earth he had turned, which had come up black and wet in a season when every other furrow in the parish broke to dust, and he unyoked the team and led them home and said nothing to anybody. Word went round anyway, because word always does, and the next morning men crossing Church Field toward their own strips turned aside to look, Walter's father among them. What they found was plain in one sense and impossible in another, for the half furrow was gone, not filled, since filled ground sits low and loose along its seam, but closed so completely that the coarse grass stood unbroken from one end of the black lands to the other, and the sods Allard had turned were nowhere. A hard frost had come in the night and lay even across the whole strip, with every blade furred white, and the men remained at the edge of the dark ground in the frost, quiet for a long time. Walter's father said that what held them was not merely the closing of the furrow, but the unbroken frost, because ground repaired in darkness should still have carried a seam beneath the white, and they could find none. The court met in its timber hall some weeks after. Hugh, the reeve presiding, the reeve being the villager chosen from among the tenants to run the manor's business. A neighbor, rather than a stranger, and Roger's predecessor as Hayward duly presented that Allard had broken ground upon the Blacklands against the bylaw. The jury did not doubt him, because half of them had watched Allard walk the borrowed team out there. And the roll sits down what they did, which was to walk out to Church Field in a body and view the ground and come back and swear what they had seen. The entry survives, and men who could not read used to have it read to them at the Michaelmas court, just to hear it said, "The court finds that no ground was broken upon the Blacklands, and the fine is not taken." Every man on that jury knew both halves of the finding were true, and they let both halves stand, and that is a court rule for you. It sets down what the village agreed had happened. At that same court, Allard surrendered his wife's 2 strips nearest the Blacklands back into the Lord's hand, and took up in their place 2 poorer strips at the wet end of Mill Field that nobody else wanted, and paid the entry fine on them without being pressed for it, and he never gave the court a reason, and the court never asked him for one. He lived another 40 years and plowed that sour ground into decent ground, and was buried at St. Mildred's, an old man among his children. And the only mark the business left on him that anyone could name was this: when the work took a team along the headland beside the Blacklands, Allard gave the goad to his son and walked on the far side of the oxen, with the beasts between himself and the dark grass, every time, all his life. So that was the ground. Walter at Hale set his team toward on plow, Monday of 1348, with the blessing said and the ribbons off the beam and the frost burning off the ridges as the sun got up. He drew the first furrow of the new year straight and clean up Church Field, and when the team came level with the Blacklands, they made the turn. And I want you to hear how they made it, because Walter's father had a saying about that turn, and Walter said it to his own boys: "You do not teach a team the bend." A team that has once walked Church Field carries the bend with it afterward, and the oxen eased outward that morning with no goad and no word, the whole 8 of them together. And the furrow bowed out and ran along the edge of the dark ground and came back true on the far side, while Walter followed with his hands easy on the handles, because there was nothing for his hands to do, and the oxen had never needed telling. By dusk, The new furrows lay in their long lines up the field, with the last frost going gray in their shadows, every line bowing at the appointed place, and Walter unyoked, while the men led the beasts down to their byres. Rushlights and cooking fires came on one by one in the doorways of Culvertoon. The smell of pottage settled on the lane, and the year had begun in the manner of every year held in living memory. The fine still stood in the roll at 6 pence and had never been collected, and if you could ask the men of Culvertoon why, they would tell you plainly that no ground had ever stayed broken there. The plowing continued around the Blacklands. The village continued around the plowing, and that was the whole arrangement, kept on both sides without a word. Culvertoon kept the bend, and the Blacklands kept whatever it was keeping. That was the Blacklands, the dark strip in Churchfield that the plows of Culvertoon had always left whole. A lard once cut half a furrow into it during the hungry years, yet morning found the grass and frost unbroken, so the court entered that no ground had been disturbed and left its 6 pence fine untaken. On Plough Monday, Walter, at Hale and his oxen, kept the inherited bend without any order from his hands, and the new year opened around ground that held its own terms. The frost now gives way to the damp weeks after Candlelit, and our next account waits in the tower of St. Mildred's. Old Simon has rung its bells for 40 years, and he knows what each rope, wheel, and iron voice should do, which is why he notices when the heavy bell begins a passing toll before anyone has sent for him. Old Simon had served as sexton of St. Mildred's for 40 years by Candlelit of 1348, and the bells were the measure of his days. He opened the church before Mat Inns, swept the nave, dug where Sir John marked the churchyard ground, and climbed the narrow stair to the tower whenever an office or burial required it. Culvertoon had 2 bells, a small one for the hours, and a heavier one used on feast days and for the passing of a parishioner. And Simon knew every change in their iron voices. He knew the splice in the great bell's rope made after a wet Michaelmas, and he knew which board complained beneath his left foot when he set his weight for a toll. What follows comes from Simon's tally, from Sir John's register, and from a custom the churchwardens observed long after both men were buried. Candlelit was the feast at the start of February, when the candles for the coming year were blessed, and the households of Culvertoon brought their tallow tapers to St. Mildred's before prime. The nave that morning held the mild smell of hot wax and damp wool, and after Mass the people carried their small flames home under cupped hands. Simon remained behind to set the church in order, and when he had pinched out the last guttering end near the rood screen, he locked the south door, tried it twice, and went across the churchyard to his dinner. The tower door opened from inside the nave, so with the south door locked there was no lawful road to either bell, and Simon had both ropes neatly coiled and hung from pegs above the floor. The heavy bell sounded before sext, the office at the middle of the day. It gave one measured stroke, waded through the length of a burial prayer, and gave another, until 9 strokes had crossed the roofs and gone out over Church Field. Simon heard them from his bench, and he set down his muslin bread without finishing it, because 9 strokes were the beginning of a man's passing toll, though no word had reached him, and no one in the parish lay near enough to death for Sir John to have ordered the bell. He walked to the church without hurrying, and several neighbors came out to their doors, but nobody followed him through the churchyard because the sexton's work belonged to the sexton. The key turned cleanly in the lock, and Simon found the church empty. The rope coils remained on their pegs, with the loose ends tucked through in his own habit, while the tower stair held a thin lay of dust above the first turning and showed no mark. When he put his palm to the great rope, it was still, and when he climbed to the bell chamber, the wheel had not shifted from the chalk line he kept on the timber. A dove sat on the outer ledge, and the great bell hung quiet over the village. Simon came down, swept the dust he had disturbed, and told Sir John exactly what he had found. Sir John was a decent man with a clerk's respect for order, so he did not call the sound a warning or a wonder. He opened his register instead, ruled a narrow column beside the names of the parish, and entered conduamus 9 strokes before sext. Old Simon entered the count on the back leaf of the bell account, where wax, rope, and repairs were usually noted, and the 2 men agreed that if some explanation appeared, they would set it beside the entry. None appeared before the office of none. In the middle of the afternoon, when word came from a croft at the wet end of Mill Field that Stephen the dyer had died in his chair after dinner, quietly enough that his wife had believed him asleep. Simon rang the toll again on Sir John's order, and this time 9 strokes followed the old rule. The rope drew warm through his hands, and the chalk line moved. An earlier entry survived from before Simon was born, for Sir John found it on a loose quire kept among the parish papers. Written by a parson whose hand had gone out of use 60 years earlier. 7 strokes at Complin, ropes tied, followed by the burial of Agnes at a bridge on the second morning. The churchwarden's account from that year carried 7 pennies received for her grave, so there was no doubt which Agnes the note meant. Simon's own predecessor had left no tally, but Simon remembered his father speaking once of the heavy bell sounding in a still tower during harvest, and of the Reeves brother being found dead in his byre the following morning. It was not enough to make a pattern, yet it was enough for Simon and Sir John to keep their columns. Through Lent, the heavy bell sounded 3 more times without an order. Once it gave 2 strokes in the grey before Mat Inns, and once it gave 11 while the whole parish stood in Woodfield, finishing a day of owed week-work, with Simon among them, and the church visible below. The 3rd toll came during a hard rain after Complin, when the church was locked and the ropes had been tied back because damp made them stretch. Each time Simon went first to the south door, found it locked, and found the coils resting in the form he had left them. Sir John entered the hour and the number, and within a day or 2 another line went into the burial register. The number of strokes did not give the number of the dead, nor did the hour tell when the death would come. It announced that a name would soon be needed, and by Lady Day every mark in the bell column had its name set beside it. The people of Culvertoon heard the strokes, of course, because a church bell belongs to every roof it reaches. But they did not gather beneath the tower or ask Simon to explain what he could not explain. They waited for the proper toll, and when it came, they carried bread or firewood to the household that needed it, and the work of the village went on. Simon noticed only one change, for before that Lent a passing toll had brought people to their doors at once, with their heads turned toward St. Mildred's while they counted. Afterward they still counted, but they kept their hands to the task before them, binding hurdles or carding wool, and nobody looked toward the tower until the final stroke had gone. On the third evening before Lady Day, the feast kept near the spring turning of the year, Simon climbed after Vespers to inspect the great bell. The wheel was sound, the clapper pin sat firm, and the bell bore no fresh scrape where metal might have moved. He renewed the chalk line on the beam, descended, and tied each rope with a thread passed through the knot and sealed in wax from Sir John's desk. Then the two men locked the church together. Sir John kept the key in the small chest beside his bed, and Simon slept in the church porch, wrapped in his cloak, because careful men sometimes require one night of certainty, even when certainty has little use to offer them. The toll began deep in the night between Compline and Matins. One stroke entered the porch through the stone, and after the proper pause a second followed, then a third, until Simon had counted 10. He could see the south door from where he lay, and knew nobody had crossed it, while Sir John came down the lane with the chest key already in his hand. They opened the church together, and the wax seals still covered the rope knots. In the tower, the chalk line was unbroken, and nothing stirred except the old timbers easing under the cold. Sir John lit a rushlight at the altar, and Simon sat beside the coiled ropes until Matins, because neither man had any other honest work to do. For 2 days they waited for the name, and no name came. Sir John visited every house, carrying the excuse of a Lenten collection, and found the village well. On the eve of Lady Day, he opened both books on the altar step and ran his finger down the entries, because a count that appears to fail must be checked from the beginning. Simon's tally held 5 untimely tolls since Candlelit, while the register held 4 deaths, so 1 empty place remained between the columns. Sir John closed the books without guessing whose name would fill it, and the great bell stayed quiet above them, because it had already given all it meant to give. The name entered the register was Sir John's. He was not ill that night, and he said Mass on Lady Day with his familiar steady attention, blessed the seed to be carried out for spring sowing, and corrected a boy who had brought an untrimmed taper into the chancel. When the bell marked none, he handed his register to the priest sent from Perthshire for the feast, showed him the untimely column, and asked that both books be kept together. Then he sat in the south sun beside St. Mildred's wall, where old Simon found him, after Vespers with his hands folded and his face at rest. Nothing in the parish account suggests fear or pain, and the burial entry was made on the next ruled line in the visiting priest's hand. After that, the sexton's bell tally became part of the churchwarden's keeping. A new parson came from Perthshire, and Simon showed him the tied ropes, the chalk line, and the paired columns without adding any belief of his own. The new man counted what was there and continued it, and so did the men who followed him. Through the years, the heavy bell sometimes gave its measured strokes before any hand had taken the rope, and the churchwardens entered the hour, while the parson later entered the name. The 2 columns never disagreed again, although they gave no warning a household could use because nobody knew whose toll had sounded, and they offered no time in which anything could be changed. Culvertoon did not ask a custom to offer more than it had. Old Simon served until his knees would no longer take the tower stair, and on the day he gave the keys to his successor, he taught the common tolls first, then showed him the back leaf of the bell account. His last instruction was practical. When the heavy bell sounded and the ropes were still, count carefully, enter the hour, and do not ring an answering stroke. The bell was never wrong, he said, but it was early, and those were different matters. The rule remained at St. Mildred's long after Simon's own name had been set beside a count, and each new sexton received it with the keys, while above him the great bell waited in the dark timber of the tower, asking no hand for permission and giving no name before its hour. That was old Simon, and the bell that sounded while St. Mildred stood locked, and its ropes remained coiled. Sir John entered every untimely toll beside the burial register, and each count found its name, including the count that belonged to Sir John himself. The bell gave cue over tune, no name soon enough to help, and no warning that could change an entry, so the sextons kept a simpler rule: count the strokes, enter the hour, and never answer. Across the surviving columns, the bell was never wrong, only early. We move on to Lady Day and remain beside St. Mildred's, where a narrow stone anchor hold stands against the north wall. A woman named Dame Aveline entered that room in 1287 to live out her years in prayer, and 61 Lady Days later, her young voice still answers through the dark opening toward the altar. The north wall of St. Mildred's Church had a little stone room built against it, narrow enough that 3 long steps would cross the floor, and low enough for a tall man to touch the roof beam. It was called the anchor hold, and an anchoress was a woman enclosed there for life to keep prayer beside the church, with one small window opening through the wall toward the altar, and another opening outward beneath the eaves. The inward opening was a squint, cut at an angle so she could see the raising of the host at Mass, while the outer opening admitted food, counsel, and the few words she chose to give the village. In the spring of 1348, the woman within was known as Dame of Aileen, and St. Mildred's register said she had been enclosed on Lady Day of 1287. Lady Day was the feast of the Annunciation, kept near the beginning of spring, and it was also a day for rents, leases, and other reckonings that wanted a clean quarter of the year. On that feast in 1287, according to the oldest register, Abbe Lean had walked into the anchor hold after Mass while the parish stood in the churchyard. The bishop's man read the office for enclosure. The mason closed the little door with stone and lime, and the village saw her no more. She was not buried there, and she was not imprisoned, because she had entered freely, and the outer window remained open behind its wooden shutter. Yet the office was understood to last until her death. The parson who made the entry called her a woman of 26 years, clear in speech and sound in body. 61. Lady Days had passed by the year this story belongs to, and during that span, the church roof had been stripped and rethatched twice. 3 parsons had served and gone into the ground, and children who once carried bowls to the outer window had lived long enough to send grandchildren in their place. Through all of it, the voice behind the shutter remained young, soft, and exact. It never weakened in winter, never roughened with age, and never belonged to any face the parish could look upon. Cool Vertun had long ago stopped counting Dame Aveline's years, because a village has many counts to keep and gains nothing by carrying one that will not close. Each morning after prime, Edith at Mere brought the anchoress, a wooden bowl of pottage and a small loaf of muslin, the village bread made from wheat and rye ground together. Edith set them on the ledge, rang the handbell fixed beside the shutter, and waited until a voice said that the gift had been received, although she never heard the shutter lift. If she went back after sext, the middle office of the day, the bowl stood empty and clean, with the loaf gone and no crumb left on the stone. On some mornings, the food remained untouched through none and Vespers, and then Edith carried it home, while on the following morning she brought a fresh portion without asking whether anyone inside had eaten. The anchoress did not speak often, but Coel Vertun had uses for the speech she gave. A widow, uncertain about taking over her husband's strips, might stand below the eaves and state the matter, and after a quiet interval, the voice would tell her which neighbor could lend an ox for the boon work. A girl whose merché was due before marriage might ask whether the Lord's fine could be paid after harvest, and Dame Aveline would remind her that the court had allowed it once in a wet year. She offered no visions and named no saints beyond those named at Mass. Her counsel concerned seed, kin, rent, and the keeping of promises, and it proved dependable, because she remembered every household and every agreement made at the window. Sir John had inherited the care of the anchor hold with the church books, and he kept it in his practical fashion. At Condulmas, he replaced the candle passed through the Squint. At Martinmas, he sent a basket of apples from the parsonage tree. and once a year on Lady Day, he asked through the outer shutter whether Dame of Aileen required a priest, a physician, or any repair to the cell. The answer was usually that the north gutter needed clearing, or the roof had taken damp above the beam. Her voice addressed him by name, and when he first came to Cool-Vertoon, she told him where his predecessor had stored the spare altar linen, though that man had been buried before Sir John was born. What troubled Sir John was not her age alone, because age may be misinterred and a name may pass from one enclosed woman to the next. He searched the registers for a burial, a new enclosure, or even the expense of reopening the wall, and found none. Every Lady Day from 1287 carried a brief note in the parson's hand of that year. "Dame of Aileen," answered, and the wall stood sound. The first parson wrote the words in brown ink. His successor continued them in black, and the third used a narrow hand that crowded the margin. Yet none entered a death, and none recorded another woman. The mason's accounts showed only repairs to mortar and thatch, all done from outside. The church wardens had paid for no broken wall in 61 years. In the week before Lady Day of 1348, rain came down on Worcestershire and filled the Wen Brook to the mill sill. Water ran from the church roof into the yard, and Sir John saw that the old north gutter had drawn loose above the anchor hold. He called the thatcher and had a ladder set against the outer wall, then went to the shutter to tell Dame of Aileen that boots would be on her roof, but no answer came. He rang the little handbell and stated the work again, and when the room remained quiet, he postponed the repair for a day because no laborer in Cool-Vertoon would climb over the cell without the Ancu-Ress's leave. The next morning, Edith's pottage remained on the ledge, and the morning after that, it remained again. Sir John listened at the Squint during prime and heard no prayer from the other side. By the third day, the thatcher said the gutter could not wait, for water had begun to darken the church wall, so Sir John brought Hugh Attess, Well and old Simon to witness what must be done. They rang the handbell together, called Dame of Aileen by name, and waited through the length of a psalm before Hugh told the thatcher to climb. The man repaired the gutter under a low sky while the three witnesses stood below. When he reached the stone edge of the cell, he paused, because tucked beneath the loose thatch was a row of little wooden tallies, each one no longer than a finger, and notched once at either end. There were 60 of them, dried pale by years beneath the roof, with an empty place at the end of the row. Hugh brought them down in his cap, and Sir John recognized the split hazel used for parish accounts, though no account in his keeping matched those marks. They carried the tallies into the church and laid them on the altar step, and before any man had decided what to enter, the voice came through the Squint. The voice thanked them for the gutter, clear and young and undisturbed, and asked Sir John to place one new tally beneath the thatch before Lady Day Mass. He asked whether Dame of Aileen was well, and after a brief silence the voice said that of Aileen had kept the year and would answer when the feast came, after which nothing more followed. Sir John cut a fresh hazel lath, notched it once at either end, and gave it to the thatcher, who set it in the empty place. The 60 old tallies went back beside it, because they had been found in the keeping of the anchor hold, and no court had ordered them taken away. On Lady Day, the village came to St. Mildred's, with rents and seed and candles for the feast. Sir John said Mass, and at the appointed place he turned toward the north wall and asked whether Dame of Aileen required a priest, a physician, or repair. Through the Squint came the customary answer, that all was well within, and the parish should begin its sowing when Woodfield dried. The register for that day holds Sir John's usual line, Dame Aveline answered, and the wall stood sound, followed by another line noting that 61 tallies lay under the north eave. His hand did not waver, and the next entry concerns 3 hens owed for a cottage. Edith brought the bowl again after prime, rang the bell, and heard the voice receive it, while doves worked quietly along the church eaves. At sext, the bowl stood empty and clean, and the loaf was gone. Nobody opened the wall, because no need had been shown, and an enclosure freely kept was not a thing. Decent people broke to satisfy account. Lady Day came again in later registers, and each year another tally went beneath the thatch, while each parson asked the old question and the young voice answered. The wall remained sound, the squint remained dark, and Culver Toon accepted the answer it was given, which was that Dame Aveline had kept the year and would keep the next one too. That was Dame Aveline, enclosed beside the church in 1287, whose clear voice remained unchanged when everyone who had first heard it was gone. Sir John could find no burial, no later enclosure, and no opening in the wall, while the old roof held 60 small tallies and an empty place for the year then beginning. A new tally was added. The food disappeared from the outer ledge, and the parish accepted the yearly answer that Aveline had kept her term and would keep another. Spring has reached Roguet Shoontide now, when the people of Culver Toon walk the parish bounds behind the cross and learn every hedge, ditch, and boundary tree. Before the procession sets out, Roger the Hayward must lead one lamb above Woodfield and leave it where the grass meets the trees, fulfilling an allowance the Abbey's careful auditors never question. The manor rolls of Vertun were kept for the abbey at Pourshore, because the village was the abbey's, and enough of them survived that a patient reader can follow the place year by year through its accounts, everything entered in a clerk's small, careful hand. And in the sheep account, in almost any year you might care to open, there is one entry that stands apart from the arithmetic. One lamb, allowed by custom of the manor. No use is named, and no price. And the abbey's auditors, who argued over a halfpenny of thatching twine, never once set a mark against it. This story is about that entry, and about the man whose work it was to make the entry true, who in the year 1348 was the Hayward of Vertun and was called Roger. A Hayward was the officer, a village trusted with its growing things, and it was Roger's charge to keep the hedges and ditches of the 3 great fields, to turn stray beasts out of the young corn and shut them in the pinfold, the little stone-walled pen by the green where they waited until their owner came to pay the fine. The manor court chose its Hayward every Michaelmas at the great autumn court, and it had chosen Roger for 20 years running. Because he was steady and knew every ewe in the parish flock by her face, and because he could walk the bounds of Vertun in the dark without putting a foot wrong. Of the 3 great fields, Woodfield lay highest, running up the slope in its long strips until the plowland ended at a grass headland, and above the headland stood the wood that gave the field its name, which the rolls call the Lay Wood. The village had rights in the near part of it, timber by Lieb and pig pan, ige under the oaks in autumn, and beyond that the ground rose into older trees where nobody held rights, because it had never, in any rolls remembering, belonged to anybody. In May, the parish flock lay folded at the top of Woodfield, inside hazel hurdles that Roger and the shepherd shifted every few nights, because a fold of sheep dungs the ground it sleeps on. And the ground it sleeps on this year bears bread next year, and that slow trade between the sheep and the corn was the whole quiet arithmetic of the village's living. Rogay Shun Tide came in May, 3 days of procession in the week before Ascension Day, when the whole parish walked its boundaries behind the cross and the banners, beating the bounds so that every child would carry the shape of the parish in his body, long after the old men who showed it to him were in the churchyard. And on the Monday of Rogay Shun Tide, before the bell of St. Mildred's rang, prime being the first office of the working morning, Roger went up to the hurdles in the mist and chose a lamb with nobody there to watch him. That privacy was never a rule anyone could point to, and yet in all the years of the custom nobody ever happened to be standing by, and Roger himself could not have told you how the choosing went. Only that the lamb came away beside him on a hemp halter going easy, and that they always went easy, though every shepherd alive knows a lamb new to the halter fights it. He led it up the headland to the edge of the trees, slipped the halter, set the lamb down in the deep grass, and came away without looking back, because he had been taught to come away without looking back, and he did not speak of it afterward, and nobody asked him to. Now the strangeness of that, for a man in Roger's office, was one he lived alongside his whole working life, because strays were his trade. You will push through a gap the width of a prayer book to get at young barley, and a lamb parted from its mother will cry along a hedge until somebody finds it. But no lamb left at the wood's edge on a Rogay Shun Monday had ever strayed home, not in his time, and not in any time the old men could put a name to. No bones were ever come upon up there, and no wool was ever found in the thorns, though no wolf had been taken in that country since before his grandfather held land. What there was, each year on the morning after, was a pressed ring in the deep grass, where a beast had lain the night through, the dew unbroken all around it, and nothing more. Roger had the custom from the Hayward before him, a man remembered as Edwin at Wood, which is only to say Edwin at the Wood, because bynames in that time were taken from where a man lived or what he did. Edwin handed it over across a winter of mending fold hurdles, in pieces, folded in among other talk. Because that is how working men hand over the parts of a trade that are not spoken of in front of others. Choose before light, lead it kindly, slip the rope at the grass line, and let the day close on it. Roger asked him once, being young, what the lamb was for. And Edwin twisted his hazel a while, and then said that the lamb was not for anything, it was of custom. And that the difference between those two was nearly the whole of what he had left to teach, because a reason can be argued with, and custom is what remains when the reasons have gone down under the grass, and it is kept because it is kept. Once, and once only that the rolls know of, the custom was not kept, and that was in the time of the great rains, 30 years before and more, when the corn rotted standing and the whole country went hungry. The abbey, hungry with it, sent a clerk to go through its manners accounts and strike out whatever could not justify itself. He was not a fool, and he was not wicked. He was an auditor in a starving year, and an allowance of 1 lamb to no named use was, in his ledger, waste. So the entry was struck, and that Roge shuntide no lamb went up the headland. Before shearing, the murin was in the folds, murin being the old word for a plague among beasts. And there is no more to be said of that summer than what the Meek-ul Mus account says, which is that of 11 score sheep counted at the washing, not 5 score came to the fold at Martinmas, and that the wool clip was not worth the carting to pure sure. The account of the year following has the lamb back, entered in a new hand, in the same old words, and no clerk of the abbey has struck it since, and none has asked. The processions went out on all 3 days, a different reach of the bounds each day. And the day they walked, the top of Woodfield, was the Tuesday. Sir John the parson went first with the cross. Sir being the courtesy a parish priest was given in that time, then the banners, then everybody who could walk. And at the accustomed places, the line halted while Sir John read the gospel to the open fields, which is why the trees marking those stations were called gospel oaks, and Culvertoon had 4. There was a 5th oak on that reach, at the wood's edge above the headland, the greatest tree on the circuit, and the procession did not stop at it. The route bowed out around it, a long bend into the ploughland that added a furlong to the walk, and along the bend the banners were carried low, and no gospel was read. And no boy was bumped against a mark to fix it in his memory, and no boy ever needed to be, because no child of Culvertoon was ever taught which oak on the bounds was not theirs, and no child was ever in doubt of it. Roger was not a curious man, which is likely why the office sat well on him, but he watched what a stockman cannot help watching. From the fold at dusk, the lamb could be seen at the wood's edge in the last of the light, small and pale against the dark under the trees, easy, and then the light would go, and in the morning there would be the pressed ring and the empty grass line. In all his years, he never saw anything come for it, and never heard anything either, though sound carries off that hill. What stayed with him was the ewes, and he spoke of it only once, to the man he taught in his own turn, because, A ewe that loses a lamb calls for it, 2 days and 3 days, walking the fold line, and there is no sadder sound in a working year. The ewe whose lamb went up the headland never called, but went out to grass in the morning already settled, and Roger said that was the one part he never got used to, that the mothers were ahead of the men in their understanding of it, and had made their peace before ever the halter was slipped. The church took its tenth of everything, because that is what a tithe is, the 10th part of all increase, and lambs were counted along with sheaves. So every spring, Sir John stood at the fold gate and told the year's fall of lambs through it, marking every 10th for the church. He was a careful keeper of his registers, careful to a hen's egg, the village said, and his lamb count, set against the shepherd's, came out one short every spring of his life, and every spring of his life he let it stand. Against 1 year's count there is a line in his own hand. In the Latin, a parson kept his books in, and what it says turned into plain speech. Is one lamb, quit by custom, the closest the written record of Culver Tune ever comes to looking straight at the thing this story has been circling. Having looked, the hand stays steady, and the register moves on to the geese. In the year this telling belongs to, the custom was kept without alteration, and Roger went up before prime on the Monday and chose without watching himself choose. Then led a lamb up the long headland with the hawthorn, heavy and white in every hedge, slipped the halter, and came away. On the Tuesday the parish walked its bounds, and Sir John read the gospel at the Four Oaks, and at the 5th the banners came down, and the line made its old bend into the ploughland. Men who had walked the bend 50 times, and children walking it the first time, and none of them stepped otherwise, and the great oak stood at the wood's edge in its new leaf, and let them all go by. The folds moved down the fallow through the summer, and the wool clip went to Purr sure after midsummer, and weighed what it always weighed, and at the Michaelmas account the clerk set down, in its accustomed place, 1 lamb, allowed, by custom of the manor. Culver Tune kept a bend in its furrows, over in Church Field, around the dark ground called the Blacklands, that no plough has ever crossed, and it kept a bend in its rogue shoon route around the oak above the headland. And nobody ever set the two side by side out loud, because to them there was nothing to set. Both bends were simply the shape the parish was. And if you had asked Roger what the lamb bought, he would have told you, without any unease at all, that he had never once thought of it as buying. And then he would have gone back to his hurdles, because the fold had to be moved before dark, and the corn was coming on, and growing things will not wait, and the custom, he trusted, would keep. That was Roger, and the lamb allowed by custom of the manor. He chose it before prime, led it to the wood's edge, and returned without looking back, while its mother remained quiet, and no lamb ever wandered home. The one rogue shun, when the custom was struck from the account, Murren emptied the folds before shearing, and the allowance returned the following year. Since then, the banners have dipped around the 5th oak, and the lamb has gone up the headland without a named purpose. The year turns toward St. John's Eve, when the bonfire burns on Culver Tune. Green and summer light remains after the Vespers bell. That light does not alter the village's rule for the hollow lane, because from Vespers until dawn, the sunken road toward Pershire is left entirely to itself. This one came down through a family rather than through the rolls, though the rolls touch it at the edges, and I will show you where they touch it when we get there. The family were the Carters of Coolvertoon, who cared for the manor time out of mind, wool to Pershore, salt from the Droitwich Way, timber, millstones once in a generation, and the rolls of the 1340s named the head of that family as William le Carter, which is only the clerk's way of writing William the Carter. What follows is what William saw with his own eyes in one summer, told to his son with instructions to keep it in the family, and kept in the family, hand to hand down the years, which is a long time to keep anything, and the keeping tells you what the family thought it was worth. Coolvertoon's back way to Pershore was the Hollow Lane, and it was well named, because the lane did not lie on the land, it lay in it. Ages of feet and wheels, and ages of rain running where the feet had worn, had sunk the road, a full man's height, and more below the fields it passed through, so that a traveler walked between two steep banks with hazel and thorn meeting overhead, in green shade at noon, and in a dark that came early of an evening. It was older than the manor, older, some held, than the Salt Way itself, the old road from Droitwich that passed a mile north of the village, along which the pack ponies had carried salt since before any name in any roll. By day, the lane was the working artery of the parish. William's carts went down it, to Pershore Market. The abbey's servants came up it, and drovers and pilgrims and peddlers all used it freely, because it saved the better part of an hour against going round by the Salt Way, and a lane that saves an hour is used, that being the whole nature of lanes. The rule was this, and every soul in Coolvertoon had it before they had their letters, which for most of them meant before ever, and instead, from the ringing of the Vespers bell at St. Mildred's, Vespers being the evening office, sung when the light begins to go. Until first light the next morning, the hollow lane was left to itself. Nobody preached the rule, and it was not in the customal, which was the written list of the manor's customs read out at the great courts, while no fine attached to it, and Sir John the parson never once spoke of it from the chancel step. That silence was itself part of the shape of it, because the customs of village writes down are the ones it needs to remember, and the ones it never writes down are the ones it cannot forget. Carts were simply out of the lane by the bell. A man caught late on the Pershore side went home round by the Salt Way and lost his hour without complaint, because that was ordinary care and nothing else. There was no story attached, and that is the part worth sitting with. A moment, nobody in Coolvertoon claimed to know what the lane did with its nights. There was no tale of a rider, no name, no grave at either end, but only the bell, and then the morning. In winter, the rule cost nothing, because Vespers came at dusk, and no one wanted the lane after dark anyway. It was midsummer that showed the rule to be a rule, because at midsummer the bell rang with 2 or 3 hours of good gold light still standing in the sky, and the hay was down and every hand was wanted. And even so, when the bell went, the lane emptied. William's daughter, this comes down in the family telling, said that of everything in her childhood, the strangest ordinary sight was that one. A dry, good, time-saving road lying empty in full evening light. The banks in flower, the thrushes going in the thorn, and every man and woman of the parish following the long field path beside it without hurry or particular attention, because that was the hour the lane stopped being theirs. St. John's Eve is Midsummer Eve, the vigil of the feast of St. John the Baptist at the very turn of the year, and in that time it was kept with fires. The village built its bonfire on the green, and there was ale, and the young folks stayed up in the long light to watch the fire, and the old folks stayed up to watch the young folk, while the working year offered no other night so free of bedtime. And that afternoon, down the road from the Saltway, there came a peddler into Coolvertoon, a stranger with his pack on his back, and no name for him ever reached any roll, so he must go through this story as the peddler. He was a pleasant man by every account of him, gray in the beard and easy on his feet, and his pack held what such packs held: pins and needles, ribbon ends, thread, a whetstone or two, small mirrors of polished steel. And he did a fair trade on the green through the evening, because a fire brings out pennies, and he gave good weight and good humor with everything he sold. Now here is the first thing, and the family telling is exact about the order, because the order is the story. William knew him, not merely knew of him, but knew his face and greeted him by it. 6 weeks before, in Rogesh on week in May, William had taken a load down to Pershore at first light, and at the far mouth of the hollow lane, where the banks open out onto the Pershore road, he had met this man stepping into the morning, dusty and easy under the pack on his back, with the dew still gray on the grass. They had passed a good morning between them, and the peddler had asked him one question, which William answered without thinking and remembered without meaning to, whether the fires had burned well the night before. William, taking it for some pure sure matter or the feast of some saint he had lost count of, said, fair enough. He believed they had, and the peddler nodded, well pleased, and went off south toward the abbey, and that had been the whole of it. So when William stood before him on the green at midsummer and said, friendly, that he was glad to see him back in that country, the peddler looked at him with an easy face and no knowledge in it at all, and said that he had never in his life been in that country until this afternoon. William let it go, because it was a fair evening, and men mistake faces, though he knew even then that he had not mistaken this one. The second thing has the same exactness. The peddler meant to sleep nowhere. He meant to walk on to Pershore in the cool of the night and be first at the market for the morrow's feast day trade. And when he said so by the fire, the men around him told him about the lane, plainly and without any drama, because to them it was road knowledge and nothing else. The Vespers bell was long past. It had gone while his pack was still open on the green, and so the lane was shut, and he was welcome to a place by the fire till first light, and the walk would keep. He thanked them, and he was gracious about it, but he said that the night was short, and the moon was near full, and his legs were his own, and no one pressed him further. Because the rule was Coolvertoon's rule, and he was not Coolvertoon's man. And there is a courtesy in old villages that will warn a stranger kindly, and more than once, but will never lay hands on him. William walked him down past the church to the mouth of the lane, mostly so the warning could be said once more, quietly, and it was said, and it was thanked for. And the peddler shifted his pack and went in between the banks with the bonfire light behind him. The banks of a sunken lane hold sound, so William stood at the mouth a while and heard the steps going away down it, unhurried, fading long, and under the steps, very faint, the man whistling to himself, while an owl called once from the hazel before everything went quiet, and William returned to the fire. The peddler was not at Pershore market in the morning. William was, with a cart of wool fells, and he looked for him, first idly and then not idly, up and down the stalls and at the abbey gate, and nobody in Perthshire had seen any such man. He did not come back through Culbertoon either, that day or the next, and by the third day the village did what the law and its own conscience required, because in that time a township answered for what was found on its ground. And if a man was waylaid, the neighborhood was bound to raise the hue and cry, every man turning out at the shout to pursue, and a township that shirked it answered for the shirking at the king's court. So they searched the hollow lane in the broad middle of the day, the Reeve and William and a dozen men. The Reeve was Hugh, the villager chosen to run the manor's farming and answer for it to the abbey, and they went end to end and up both banks. And they found the lane in good order and empty, the dust unmarked, with no pack and no sign of one, nothing to raise a hue after, and nothing to enter anywhere, because there was nothing to enter. Sir John said a single line in the margin of his register that week, and it is one of the places where the written record touches this story, and all it says is, "Sought a peddler in the hollow lane." The lane in good order, the words entered in his usual steady hand. It was over the days that followed, and the quiet after the searching, that William understood what he alone in the village could understand, and the family telling keeps it in his own order. The man he met in May coming out of the far mouth at first light, and the man he watched in June walking in at the near mouth after the bell, were one man, the same face and the same pack, 6 weeks apart, and the man in May was dusty from a walk he had. By June's reckoning, not yet taken, and the question about the fires, which had made no sense on a morning in Rogae Shun week, made perfect sense on the morning after St. John's Eve, which was the morning the peddler believed himself to be walking out into. He had asked after the bonfires because for him they were one night old, and the lane had taken him in at midsummer and let him out into a May morning. The village had already lived through and spent and half forgotten. The only thing he carried out of it was a civil question that arrived 6 weeks before its answer. Nothing in the family telling says that any harm came to him. By his own reckoning, nothing had happened at all. He walked a short summer night between green banks, came out at dawn, passed a good morning with a carter, and went off south toward the abbey with his pack. Into a month that was not his, and where he went from there, and whether the count of his days ever came right again, the family did not claim to know, and neither does anyone. The other place, the record touches it, is small, and a reader would pass it by if the family telling had not survived to light it. In the court roll of the Mikul Moos following, among the ale fines and the strayed geese, the clerk entered that the township had made search after a stranger thought lost, and had found no wrong done, and the entry closes with the usual words, "and let it rest." The court of a manor was a practical instrument. It fined the breaker of hedges and the taker of short measures, and it had no heading for a man who left in June and arrived in May. So it entered what it could, which was that no wrong had been done, and that much was likely true. Some of what a village knows goes into its rolls. The rest is kept in the open, by everybody, without a word, and the rolls are written around it. William carded for the manor another 20 years, and told his son, and his son told his, and the rule went on costing 1 hour on a summer evening and nothing else, which was a small price. The lane is still there, or a lane is. That country between Perthshire and the Saltway is full of sunken ways, deep in their banks and dark at noon, and no signpost says which of them once put a man down 6 weeks behind himself. In the family telling, there is one more piece at the very end, and it is the piece the tellers always kept unchanged. On summer evenings after the bell, with night birds stirring in the thorn, William would sometimes stand at the top of his yard, which looked down toward the mouth of the lane. And the banks hold sound, and now and again, faint and far down between them, there would be steps, unhurried, and a thread of whistling, going the one way or the other. And he would listen a moment, and then go into his supper, because the lane was left to itself from Vespers to first light. And whatever hours it kept inside itself were its own, and the rule had never asked anything more of anybody than that, and it had always been enough. That was the hollow lane, and the quiet hour it kept between Vespers and first light. A traveling peddler entered after the bell on St. John's Eve and failed to reach Pershore, although William the carter had already met him 6 weeks earlier, coming from the far end after a journey the man had not yet begun. The court found no wrong to enter, and the family kept only the sound of distant steps and whistling between the banks. Culverton continued to give the lane its summer evenings, and that small allowance remained enough. By llamas, the first new loaf has been blessed. The hungry weeks are ending, and the wheat and mill field is ready for sickles. Our next account stays inside the tithe barn, where 2 tally sticks agree on every sheaf carried through the doors, although the count in the bays always holds one more. This next one is hardly a story at all, and I give it to you at this hour for exactly that reason. It has no traveler in it, and no journey. Nothing arrives and nothing is lost. It is a story about counting, and it stays the whole time inside one building, which is the tithe barn of Cool-Vertoon, the great barn that stood by St. Mildred's Church and belonged to the abbey at Purrow. It comes out of the tithe accounts and out of the memory of the men who did the threshing, which was winter work, and slow. And it is a story the village itself would have told you was not strange, and then, having said so, would not have told you anything further. Lammas falls at the 1st of August, and the name means loaf mass, because on that day the first new wheat of the harvest was ground and baked, and the loaf was brought into church to be blessed. And with that loaf, the hungry weeks ended. They called the weeks before it the hungry gap, when the old grain was running out, and the new was not yet ripe, and the pottage got thinner in every house down the lane. Pottage being the standing dish of that whole world, oats and peas and beans and whatever the garden gave, kept warm at the fire's edge. So Lammas was a threshold. The village stepped over together, and from Lammas the year tipped downhill into harvest, which was the great work of the whole round, the one that everything else all year had only ever been preparing. That year the wheat stood in Mill Field, because the 3 great fields took the crops in turn down the generations, and that year the turn had brought the wheat there, so harvest emptied the village into the strips. The men went down the ridges with sickles, cutting low and steady, and behind each reaper came a binder, gathering the cut wheat into armfuls and binding each armful into a sheaf with a band twisted out of the wheat itself. A handful of straw wrung into a rope and knotted with a turn of the wrist that belonged to that binder, so a neighbor could name the hands that tied a sheaf at 10 paces. The sheaves were leaned together in stooks, little peaked rows standing down the field to dry, and the abbey took its boon work in those weeks. The extra harvest days, every tenant owed the Lord at the year's great need, paid for in the old coin of bread and ale carried out to the field's edge at noon. And behind everything, after the carts, came the gleaners, the widows, and the children, gathering the fallen ears by custom. Because the scattering that fell from the sheaves was theirs, by a right older than the abbey, and nobody begrudged it who had any sense of how the world was held together. The last sheaf cut in the field was made much of, plaited and carried home, and kept above a hearth through the winter. Yet it was distinct from the sheaf that concerns us, because the last sheaf was cut and bound by hands everybody knew, and this other sheaf was never cut by anybody. Everything the abbey was owed came at last to the tithe barn, and the tithe barn was the largest roof in Cool-Vertoon after the church itself, timber framed on a stone sill, aisled inside with great oak posts, with double doors high enough and wide enough to take a loaded harvest cart, and a threshing floor of beaten earth in the middle bay, where the through draft ran when both doors stood open. A tithe is a tenth, the 10th part of all increase rendered to the church, of lambs, as we heard, and of fleeces and cheeses and eggs, and above all of sheaves. And so at carrying time, the carts came up from Mill Field, loaded to swaying, and at the barn doors the counting was done, because a render is nothing without a count. Sir John's clerk stood at one doorpost, and at the other stood the reeve. "Q at, well, who answered to the abbey for the manor's whole husbandry, and each of them held a tally stick, which was a lath of hazel split down its length, so that a notch cut across it, marked itself into both halves at once. And there is no honester instrument in this world, because neither half can be altered without the other calling it a liar." Sheaf by sheaf and cart by cart, the two tallies were notched together, and at the end of every carrying day, they were laid side by side, and Nick answered Nick, and the two counts had never in any year disagreed by so much as one. And then the sheaves were ricked inside, stacked into the bays to wait for threshing, and when the ricking was done, the barn was counted again, because the abbey liked its numbers twice. The count in the barn came out one more than the count at the doors, as it had in every year reached by any tally in the abbey's keeping, and the clerks of 3 generations had tested it by every method a careful clerk could devise. They counted again on other days with other men, and once they counted twice in a single afternoon with the doors barred between. Yet the answer remained fixed. So many sheaves carried in at the doors, both tallies agreeing, and that many standing in the bays, and one more. The account for each year says it in the driest words a quill can make, and the words never change, and one sheaf over of no man's carrying. Then the account moves on to the geese and the millstones, because there was nothing else to be done with it, and nowhere else to enter it, and the ink dries evenly across the page. They knew which sheaf it was, and that is the part the thresher's memory keeps, because the tallies only give the number while the men who handled the sheaves knew them hand by hand. Every binder in the parish, as I said, tied their own turn of the wrist, and a village that has bound its own harvest since before memory knows its own knots at a glance. The one sheaf over was bound in a turn that nobody in Culvertoon tied, nor anybody's mother before them. An old backhand twist, done beautifully, done by hands that knew wheat, and not one living pair of hands in that parish or any parish around it made that knot. The straw of it was always sound and dry, whatever the weather of the year had been, and the ears of it were always full, and what grain was inside those ears nobody has ever said, because no flail has ever touched it. What they did with it was done without ceremony, in the plain spirit the village brought to every custom of this kind. When the threshing was to begin, the oldest man at the threshing, and for years out of mind, that was a man called War-in, who had swung a flail through 60 winters, carried the sheaf over to the ladder at the far end bay, and took it up, and stood it on the high beam with the others. Because they were all up there, all the years, a long row of them on the beam in the dark under the thatch, going back farther than the barn's own timbers could rightly be, the near ones still golden when a rushlight was held up, and beyond them grayer and grayer, and the far ones the color of shadow, standing quiet in a place where nothing else stood quiet. For a barn is a living building, mice in every rick and sparrows in every eave, and doves down from the manor dovecote, walking the sills after spilled grain. Nothing nested in the far bay, and the thatch above that beam was never mouse-run, while the straw of those sheaves was never carried off for bedding by anything, and a building where everything is carried off for bedding by something. The threshers worked their whole lives under that long row, and did not look up at it especially, because it had been there when their fathers were boys, and a thing that old becomes furniture, whatever else it is. Once, a long while before the year we are walking through, a new clerk came out from Pershore who had not grown up under the row, and he did what a stranger to a custom always does, which is ask it to justify itself. He had one of the old sheaves handed down. The thresher's memory says it was Warren's grandfather who was made to hand it down, and that he went up the ladder slowly and came down more slowly still. And the clerk had it laid on the floor to be threshed with the rest, so that the account might for once close clean. The telling goes flat here, and I trust it the more for that, because a made-up story would have the flail refuse or the roof groan, and nothing of the kind is remembered. What is remembered is only this, that in the shuffle of a working floor, the sheaf was set down among the waiting sheaves, and by afternoon, no one on the floor. The clerk, least of all, could say which sheaf it was, because on the floor it was in nobody's hand, and the knot shows itself to hands. And the threshing went on, and every sheaf threshed that winter, threshed clean and ordinary, and at the spring counting the row on the high beam was whole. The same count as before, not one missing, and the barn's harvest count that year, entered in the driest of ink, was one sheaf over, of no man's carrying. The clerk closed his account the old way, and did not ask again, and after him nobody asked, and the asking itself went up into the dark with everything else the village had ever decided not to look at directly. And that is nearly all of it, and the rest is only the winter, which in a barn is a long, mild, murmuring season. Threshing went on from Martinmas to past Candlemus. 2 men to the floor, flails swinging turn and turn about, a slow double knock that could be heard across the churchyard on a still morning. And winnowing waited for the days when the wind stood fair through the open doors, the grain thrown up into the draught, so that the chaff walked away on the air, and the corn fell back to the floor. The corn went by cart to the mill on the Wind Brook, because the manor had mill sock, which meant every tenant ground his corn at the Lord's mill and paid the miller his toll. And it came home flour, and the flour was mostly maslin, wheat and rye ground together, which made the everyday bread of that whole world. And all winter, over the knocking of the flails and the whisper of the winnowing, the row stood on its beam in the dark of the roof, one sheaf longer than it had been the winter before, and the men below worked and grew old, and their sons took up the flails after them, under the same roof in the same row, longer again. In the year we are walking through, the rain came at harvest, and the carrying was done between showers. While the stooks stood out longer than anyone wanted, and the village got the harvest of 1348 in wet, and got it in whole, because there was no other choice, and never had been. The counting at the doors was done under sacking with the tallies kept dry in the clerk's breast, and when the ricking was finished, the count in the bays held the familiar excess of 1. Some men might have found that constancy heavy in a year when news was already stirring in the ports away to the south, but the village took it differently. Everything else was uncertain, including the weather, the roads, and the reports carried along them, while the sheaf came in its appointed manner, bound in the old knot, sound and full. And Warren, an old man by then, is remembered to have said while carrying it to the ladder that it was a comfort to see one thing in the world still minding its own terms. So the barn stands at the end of this story with its doors barred for the night, and the ricks settled, and the mice busy in every bay but one, and the rain steady on the thatch, and the row on the high beam in the perfect dark, one longer. Nobody watches it, because there has never been anything to watch. Nothing was ever seen to move up there, and nothing ever will be. And the sheaf was never anything but a sheaf, except that no man carried it in, and no man bound it, and no flail will ever open it. The count is in the account, and the account is in the abbey's chest at Pourshore, and the words are the same words down all the years, one sheaf over, of no man's carrying, and underneath the words the grain sleeps in the ricks. And the village sleeps around the barn, and the winter goes on with its slow knocking floor, and the tally sticks lie nick to nick in the chest, agreeing, and everything in Culvertoon is counted, and everything is where it was put, and one thing more. That was the extra sheaf in Culvertoon's tithe barn, bound with an old backhand knot. No living binder used and entered each year as one sheaf over of no man's carrying. No flail opened it, and every winter it joined the older sheaves standing on the high beam beneath the thatch. Even in the wet harvest of 1348, it arrived sound and full. So old wore and carried it up the ladder and took comfort from one custom, still minding its terms. Harvest bleeds into meek Ulmus when accounts close and the manor court gathers to settle the year's small debts. Hugh at well presides, the clerk calls each tenant from the roll, and one name waits at the bottom of the list, though Sir John's register says its owner has already been buried. The best stories out of Culvertoon are the ones that come down in parchment rather than in talk, because talk improves a story every time it is handed on, and parchment improves nothing. Culvertoon was a village of some 40 households in Worcestershire, held of the Benedictine Abbey at Pourshore. And because it belonged to the abbey, its business was written down, court after court, by clerks who wrote out from Perthshire with ink and a rolled skin and no imagination at all. What I am going to tell you sits in those rolls in plain entries, and I mean to keep close to them, because the entries are the story. A manor court was the small parliament of a village, and it met in the timber hall of the manor house a few times in the year. At Culvertoon, the man who presided was the reeve, Hugh. A villager chosen to run the farming year and answer to the abbey's steward for every penny of it. The court settled who had let a beast stray into the wrong field, and who had taken wood that was not his to take, and it punished nothing harshly, for its punishments were mence, which were small fines, 2 pence here and a penny there, entered on the roll and gathered in before the court rose, at none, the office in the middle of the afternoon. Everything that was said and done there was entered, and that was the comfort of the court, and in the end it was the strangeness of it as well. Every court began with the calling of the roll, and the village used by-names rather than surnames, each one saying where a man lived or what he did. Hugh at well lived by the well, and Thomas at mere, whose story this is, lived by the mere, the still pond below the mill on the Wen Brook. Thomas was a villein, which meant an unfree tenant, holding his land not for money alone but for labor owed week work on the abbey's own strips, and boon work at haying and harvest, and his half-yard land lay scattered through the 3 great fields. He did his work and answered his name at every court for upward of 30 years, and the rolls barely noticed him, which, in a manor court, was the mark of a decent life. Thomas at mere died a little before Martinmas in the year 1347, Martinmas being the feast of St. Martin in the dark end of November, when the beasts that could not be wintered were killed and salted down. Sir John, the parson of St. Mildred's Church, entered the burial in his register with the care he gave everything, and the manor took its her-eut, the Lord's old right to the best beast of a dead tenant's holding. So Thomas's red ox was led up from the mere to the abbey's byre, and that was entered too. His widow Edith took the holding for her lifetime, as the custom of the manor allowed, and the winter closed over the village with every line of the record in its right place, and there the matter should have rested. The first court of the new year fell in the week after Easter, and the clerk, calling the roll he had called for years, came down the list and read out the name of Thomas at mere before anyone thought to stop him. Because the name had stood in that place on the parchment for 30 years, and his eye and his voice went along it together, out of habit. An answer came from the back of the hall near the door. One easy word in a voice every soul in the room had known all their lives. And although the hall was full and every head turned, nobody stood where the voice had sounded. The clerk had heard an answer given to a name lawfully called, and his office was to enter what the court heard. And so, with a steady hand, he entered it. Hugh at Will was a careful man, which is why the abbey had kept him reeve for 11 years, and he did the careful thing. He went to Sir John, and the two of them laid the register beside the roll. The register said that Thomas at Mere was buried before Martinmas, and the roll said that Thomas at Mere had answered his name in Easter week. And a court may amend an error, but each entry had been made honestly by a sworn man out of what he himself had heard, and neither man would call his entry false. So word went down to the steward at Porrishire, and the steward sent back a dry and sensible ruling that a court does not sit to judge what nobody has complained of, and that so long as Thomas at Mere owed suit of court, which is to say his attendance and his dues were paid, the roll was content. So both entries stand, the burial and the answer, and from that day forward, nobody in Coolvertoon tried to make them agree. The dues were paid as well, and that summer, Roger the Hayward, whose office was to mind the fences and the folds, presented at court that the fence was down along the dead man's old strips in Mill Field. Holdings often stayed written under a dead man's name for years after, so the amercement was set against Thomas at Mere, 2d. When the clerk gathered in the fines before the court rose, there lay on the board 2 silver pennies that no hand had been seen to put there, worn nearly smooth and struck under a king. 2 reins gone, and they were cold in a hall where the hearth had been burning since morning. The clerk weighed them against a fresh penny and found them full weight and good silver, and he entered the fine as paid, because it was. After that, a custom formed without anyone deciding it, because the name kept its place on the roll, and the answer kept coming from the back of the hall near the door, always the one word, with nothing asked and nothing added. In time, the clerks took to calling that name last, after all the living had answered theirs. No ruling made it so. The order of the roll simply settled into that mannerly arrangement, and a manor court ran on manners more than it ran on law. The Michaelmas Court of 1348 was the great court of the year, Michaelmas being the feast of St. Michael at the end of September, when the harvest was in and the year's accounts were closed. The hall smelled of new straw, and the tithe barn by the church stood full, and there was a season's worth of business to get through. Pennies for the pigs turned loose on the acorns of Woodfield, and strays to cry from the pinfold, which was the village pound, and the court worked down through all of it in order. At the end of the roll came Thomas at Mere, and the name was called, and the answer came from the back near the door, and the clerk entered it. And the bell rang none from St. Mildred's Tower, and the court rose and went out into the September evening, every line of it ordinary, and every line of it entered. The winter that followed was the winter of the great dying, which is what Coolvertoon called the pestilence that came up the roads from Bristol, and I will not carry you through that winter here, because it has its own telling. It is enough to say that when the court could next meet, in the spring of 1349, the clerk's work was heavy. Name after name was called once, out of respect for the order of the roll, and answered nothing, and was struck through with the hair E. Noted beside it, beast after beast, entered against households that would not plow again, and it was slow work, and the hall was quiet at it. And at the foot of the roll, the clerk came to the last name, and he called it into that quiet. And the answer came from the back near the door, the one easy word, in the voice men had known all their lives. Of every name on the roll of Folkloric that spring, the newest entries were the ones the winter had emptied, and the one name the winter had not touched at all was the name that had been buried at Martinmas a year and more before. The court sat a moment with that, and then it went on to the fences, because the fences needed going on to. The rolls of Folkloric run on for many years past this story, through changes of clerk and changes of ink, and the name goes down the parchment with the rest of the village's business. Whoever came new to the clerk's work learned the order of the roll from the man before him, and he called the last name last and entered what he heard. And on the latest of the rolls that survives, made when everyone who had stood in the hall that Easter week was long gone, the name is entered fair at the foot of the list, and against it, in a small steady hand, stands the one word the rolls had always said against the living, and no other mark at all. That was Thomas at a Mere, buried before Martinmas and still present at every court when his name was called. The answer came from the back of the hall. His amercements were paid in old silver, and the steward at Pershire found no complaint that required either honest record to be amended. In time, the clerks called Thomas last, after the living, and through the great dying, his was the one name on the roll that continued without interruption. Advent now closes the village roads, and winter settles over the hurdles placed at every lane. The passing bell falls silent while Sir John keeps his lists. Yet, between Complin and Mat Inns, another small light begins to move through Folkloric, pausing at some barred doors and leaving no footprint in the snow. What I can tell you about the winter of the Great Dying in Culvertoon comes out of 2 records and 1 family. The records are the register of Sir John, the parson of St. Mildred's Church, a decent, unimaginative man who wrote things down carefully all his life, and the tally kept by old Simon the sexton, who had rung the bells of that church for 40 years. The family is the Carters, whose house stood on the lane up from the mill, and whose telling has come down alongside the parchment and never once quarreled with it. It is a winter story, told quietly, because the village itself kept it quietly, and I mean to keep it that way. The sickness came up from Bristol in the autumn of 1348, moving along the roads with the carts and the packmen, and word of it moved faster than it did. By Advent, which is the 4 dark weeks before Christmas, Culvertoon had shut itself. Hurdles out of the sheepfolds were set across the ends of the lanes. Nobody went down to the market at Pershore and the old Saltway from Droitwich. A mile north of the village, which had carried carts every day of every year in living memory, went silent, so that the wind came over it carrying no wheel sound at all. Men who had grown up within sound of that road said afterward that its silence was the first strange thing of the winter and the hardest to sleep under. Inside the hurdles, the village did what winter villages did, because beasts must be fed, whatever else is true. The oxen were foddered in the byres, and the sheep were brought down close, and the muslin, the mixed corn of wheat and rye that made the household bread, went to the mill while the Wen Brook still turned the wheel. Rushes were drawn through kitchen tallow to make the winter's rushlights, and the doors were barred at dark. Compline was rung, Compline being the last office of the day, and after Compline, the village lay still under the snow. 40 households of banked fires and sleeping breath, waiting for the winter to pass over, or not to. Sir John kept his lists, and when the dying came into the village, and it did come, he wrote the names in his register, small and even, one under another, and when a page was full, he ruled the next, and went on. I am not going to read you those names, and he did not read them out either, for the village had no need of telling. Old Simon rang the passing bell in the proper manner at first, the tellers being counted strokes that told the parish whether it had lost a man or a woman. But as Advent went on, the ringing was set aside, there being more of it than one old man could do, and the tower fell silent. The bell of St. Mildred's, which in better years had been known to sound a mortuary toll of its own accord, early but never wrong, had nothing to say that winter either, and nobody said aloud what they took its silence to mean. It was the Carter's wife who saw the light first, and the family kept the particulars. It was a night in Advent, between Compline and Mat Inns. Mat Inns being the office rung long before dawn, and she was awake with the cold, and through the gap of the shutter she saw a small light come up the lane from the mill. It moved at a slow walking pace, low, carried at the height a lantern is carried, and it did not swing, and it made no sound. It stopped at the door of the house across from theirs, and stood there a long while, not moving at all, and then it went on toward the church gate and passed out of the line of the shutter, and the lane was dark again. The sensible reading, and everyone made it, was that this had been Sir John going out to some sick house with the sacrament, for a priest will go out at any hour, carrying a lantern and a little handbell, so the world knows what passes. But the sacrament never went out without its bell, and this light went in silence. And Sir John asked plainly after Mass, said plainly that he had been abed from Complin to Mat Inns, and there had been new snow, and the carter's wife, going out at first light, found the lane unmarked from the hurdles to the church gate, no print of boot nor paw in it, going or coming, and she kept that particular to herself for 3 days before she could say it. Through that winter the light became a regular thing, and there is no better word for it. It did not walk every night, but on the nights it walked it kept one round, up from the mill, along the row of crofts, past the church gate, and down to the mouth of the hollow lane. The sunken back way toward Pershire, where the hurdles stood, and the hurdles did not hinder it, and it troubled nothing, not the dogs, and not the beasts in the byres. And it paused at doors, which was the whole of what it did. At some doors, it stood only a moment, and at others a long while, and the households inside, lying awake, would see the thin line of its light steady under the door-sill, and hear nothing at all. No step, and no breath, and no knock. And after a time, the light would draw away and go on, and no door was ever tried, and nothing was ever asked of anyone. The village's manner with it settled quickly, because Culvertoun was an old village and had old habits with things it did not name. Nobody watched for it on purpose, and nobody spoke of it in the morning, and the households it had stood at did not say so, though in a village of 40 households it was known all the same. Some families, when the light was in the lane, would rake the fire low and sit quiet until it had gone by, not out of terror, but out of an old courtesy, keeping still while a thing that was none of their business went about it. The doors it stood at were barred already, and there was nothing to do that was not already done. The dying eased as the winter turned, and it was Hugh. The reeve, a man whose whole office was tallies, who at last laid the two accounts side by side. The doors the light had stood longest at, and the houses where Sir John's register had needed no entry all winter. And however a man laid those two lists together, they came out the same, house for house, and nobody tried it more than once. Sir John was shown the matter, and looked at it a long time, and he wrote nothing in his register about it at all. And from a man who wrote everything down, nothing is its own kind of entry. Candlemas comes at the start of February, when the year's candles are blessed in the church, every household bringing its own to carry home lit. And that year fewer hands came up the nave to the blessing than the year before, and nobody remarked on the empty places, because remarking was not the village's habit. And that night, with the snow lying hard and blue under a full moon, the light came up from the mill one more time and walked the whole round of the village, and this time it paused at every door that still had fire behind it. Everyone taking the greater part of the night over it, from Complin until nearly Mat Inns, while somewhere off over Mill Field an owl was hunting, and neither took any notice of the other. And when the Mat Inns bell rang, old Simon being back at his ropes by then, it had passed the church gate going north, out beyond the hurdles, toward the old salt way, and it was not seen in Culvertoun again. Spring opened the roads, and the carts came back along the salt way, and the hurdles went back to the folds, and the village took up its year where the year was waiting. Nobody fixed a name on the light, then or after, and Sir John's register holds that winter's names and not one word more. And the Carter's family handed the seeing of it down plainly, without ornament. Only one small custom formed out of it, and for years afterward, on the eve of Candlelit, the fires of Coolvertoon were left unraked and burning low until matins. And a child who asked the reason was told it was an old courtesy of the house, kept since a hard winter, and that was all the answer there ever was, which is how Coolvertoon kept most of what it kept, and it kept it well. That was the slow light that walked Coolvertoon during the winter of the Great Dying. It made one silent round between Complin and matins, pausing at doors without trying them, and the households kept still while it went about work nobody named. Q. At. Well, later set its longest pauses beside Sir John's register, and found that those were the houses the dying had passed over. On Condurmus night, the light stopped at every door with a living fire, went north beyond the hurdles, and did not return. The year has nearly completed its circle, and for our last story we return to Churchfield on Plough, Monday of 1349. The village is thinner, the first furrow waits beneath the frost, and Walter at a hail stands behind his team once more, while his son carries the goad. This ground and its bend are already familiar, and the telling can move more slowly now. We end the night where the year began, because that is where Culvertoon ended it too, at the head of a furrow in Church Field on Plough Monday morning in January of 1349. Plough Monday is the first Monday after Twelfth Night, the last night of Christmas, when the ploughs of England went back to their work. And you have heard this story before, at the start of the night, and it has not changed, because it is not a story that changes, only a story that is kept. The village that walked out to the fields that morning was thinner by many hearths than the village that had walked out the plough Monday before, and every soul in it knew the empty places, and nobody spoke of them, and the work was the same work. The man at the plough was Walter at a Hale, who lived on the nook of land under the church, and who had drawn the first furrow of the year in Culvertoon for above 20 years. And he had come through the winter of the Great Dying, which was what the village called the pestilence that had shut it in since Advent. His boy John walked at the head of the team now, old enough this year to carry the goad and call the oxen by their names, and the frost was down hard, and the light was not yet up over Woodfield when they came out through the gate. On the Sunday the plough had stood at the church door, as it stood every year, and Sir John, the parson of St. Mildred's, had blessed it, and the men who would follow it, and the small bell had been rung for the blessing. Inside the church, the plough light was burning. The candle the ploughmen of the parish kept lit before the rood screen, out of a penny paid by every man who held plough beasts, and there were fewer pennies that year, and the candle burned the same. Eight oxen went out, yoked in pairs, their breath standing in the air over them, drawing the great plough with its coulter, which is the knife that cuts the sod, and its share that lifts the slice, and its mold board that turns it over. The frost had gone deep in the night, so the first furrows broke stiff and clean, and the rooks came down behind the team to work the turned ground, following the first furrow of another remembered year. The ploughing of an open field goes by strips, long, narrow lands lying side by side, each man scattered among his neighbors, and a team works down a strip and turns on the headland, the rim of unplowed ground at the end where the oxen come around. The pace of it is the pace of oxen, which is the pace that whole world moved at, and the sounds of it were few and steady. The creak of the yokes and the low voice of the boy, to the beasts at the turn, and then down the next furrow, and the next after it, while the sun came up small and white over Woodfield, and the morning went along. And along the north side of Churchfield, the furrows began, one strip after another, to lean. Anyone standing at the field gate could see it, the long lands bending together in one easy curve, all of them the same, because in that part of the field lies the Black Lands, a strip of darker ground longer than any land in the parish, and no furrow has ever crossed it. The bend is in the field pattern itself, older than any man's memory of the pattern, and the court rolls of the manor set a fine against any man who breaks ground there, and the fine has never once needed collecting. That morning a small wind was moving over the field, and the frost lay on the Black Lands, even and thin, the same frost that lay on every land around it, and the ground under the frost was its own dark self, and the teams came down toward it with the sun climbing behind them. Walter's hands put the team over at the bend before his eyes had any need to look, because his hands had made that turn every year for above 20 years, and his father's hands before his. And the oxen leaned into it of themselves, having made it every working year of their lives, and the boy at the head turned with them, and no word was said, because no word was needed. The plow came around the dark ground wide and easy, a courtesy it paid to nothing else in that field, and then the land ran straight again, and the furrow went on. At midday they sat at the headland out of the wind for their nooning, with maslin bread, the mixed wheat and rye bread of the village, and a little hard cheese. And the boy, being of the age for it, asked his father about the ground, and Walter told him the story his own father had told him at that same headland. Once, long before, in the time of the great-grandfathers, a man set his coulter into the edge of the Blacklands, for a wager or out of temper. The story keeps both, and cares about neither. And he drew half a furrow into that dark ground before his own team stopped and would not draw on, and he left the furrow lying open and went home, unquiet. And in the morning the ground lay whole under the frost, the half furrow not filled in but closed, the sod one piece again, the grass roots knitted over where the shear had gone. And there was no line to be seen, and there was nothing to fine the man for, because the court could find no broken ground, and so the fine, the one time it was ever earned, was never collected. The boy asked what would come of it if a team plowed straight across, and Walter told him that nobody knew, because nobody ever had, and that this was the whole of the answer, and that it had been answer enough for longer than anybody had been alive. And the boy did not ask again, because it was January of 1349, and the village had just wintered through the great dying, and come out of it thinner and standing. And there was not a man in Church Field that morning of a mind to alter one particle of anything cool Vertun had always kept. The ground had held to its terms through the worst year anyone could remember. Those terms had been kept on both sides, and nobody wished to know more about them. The afternoon went on in bouts, down the strip and around at the headland, and down again, and Hugh, the reeve of the manor, walked the headlands counting the lands, turned. Because the abbey's main strips, the Lord's own land, had to be plowed by the village's owed week work along with its own, and rent does not winter. The bend was taken, and taken again as the teams worked north through the field, and nobody looked at the Blacklands particularly, and the Blacklands lay in the middle of the working field the whole short day, dark and quiet under the thin January sun. They unyoked at dusk, before the Vespers bell, Vespers being the evening office, and the oxen went home along the lane to the byre and their fodder, and the plow was left standing at the head of the morrow's land, and the frost came down again behind the light. In the houses there was the fire, and the pot of pottage, the standing stew of peas and leeks that fed that whole world. And in the dark of St. Mildred's the plow light burned on before the rood screen, and the village slept, and the year was begun again. Those fields are grass now, and have been grass for centuries, and where the old plow land went over to pasture the ridges of it set into the turf and stayed. So that a man walking a Worcestershire pasture in low evening light can still see the long lands rising and falling under the grass. And here and there in that country, the lands lean together in one long, easy curve around a piece of ground they never crossed. And nobody now can say why the bend is there. And the bend is there all the same. The names are gone, and the rolls lie in a library, and the terms have outlasted every soul who ever kept them. And the ground keeps them still, quietly, asking nothing at all of anyone who lets it be. That was the year come round at the Blacklands, with Walter, his son, and the oxen making the old turn without a spoken direction. At the nooning, Walter passed down the account of Aylard's half-furrow and the seamless frost that covered it by morning, while the court's uncollected fine remained ready for ground no man could keep broken. Vertoon had carried its customs through seed time and harvest, through the shut roads and quiet winter, and it began again by keeping the bend. We leave the village there, with the plow standing at the head of tomorrow's strip. The animals settled in their byres, and low fires behind the doors. The bell, the anchor hold, the oak, the lane, the sheaves, the court roll, and the slow winter light have all returned to their places in the parish memory, where nothing more is required of them tonight. The stories are finished, and only the steady rain remains on the thatch, while Vertoon keeps until morning.